This video is sponsored by NordVPN. Before World War I, Eastern Europe was made up of a few large empires. After the war, it consisted of many smaller republics. This change signified the transition of Eastern Europe into the contemporary era, which lasts to this day. The dissolution of the imperial powers and the end of the old order only happened because the imperial powers did not make peace until they had collapsed from the inside due to war exhaustion. This video will look at the combat on the Eastern Front and attempt to answer the question, why did these powers of Eastern Europe continue to fight until their destruction? Although World War I began as a conflict in the Balkans, the largest part of the fighting took place between the Entente nations against Germany. In the latter half of the 19th century, Germany grew increasingly strong, and it made its neighbors of Great Britain, France and Russia feel threatened, making them enter into an alliance with each other in order to prevent the potential German domination of Europe. At the same time, Germany made an alliance with Austria-Hungary. When the war began in 1914, the Entente nations of Russia and France wanted to use their numerically superior militaries to bring Germany down by launching offensives from west and east in order to overwhelm the German forces. On the Eastern Front, the Russian forces prepared for an offensive towards Berlin. But the road to Berlin was not simple. The advance towards Berlin would be vulnerable to the Central Powers' attacks from German East Prussia and Austro-Hungarian Galicia. So before moving towards Berlin, Russia decided to secure its flanks by occupying these territories. For this reason, the first Russian operations would be directed against East Prussia and Galicia. First, we will look at the operations in Galicia. On this part of the front, Russia deployed 4 armies against 3, and the Russian army was of better quality than the Austro-Hungarian. With the advantage in numbers and quality on its side, the Russian forces defeated the Austro-Hungarian army and soon occupied most of Galicia. With that, the Russian army had achieved one of its objectives and secured the southern flank. Its other objective was to secure the northern flank. At the same time, fighting was taking place in East Prussia. Here, Russia had a strong numerical advantage, with it having 2 armies against 1 German army. But the German forces held a strong advantage in force quality, making the strength of both sides equal. In the beginning, the Germans were unable to resist the numerically superior Russian forces and had to fall back. But soon, the Russians made a mistake. They transmitted their battle plans without encryption, and the Germans intercepted their radio traffic, which allowed the Germans to set a trap for the Russian forces. This really illustrates the need to keep your communications secure. And with this perfect segue, the intelligence officer will tell you about this video's sponsor, NordVPN.
Do not use NordVPN, because if you do, then we won't be able to see what you do online.
NordVPN creates a secure encrypted tunnel for your internet traffic. This means your online data is shielded from prying eyes, and even your internet service provider. It helps to protect your information. NordVPN does not have bandwidth or data limits for VPN traffic. You can connect up to 10 devices with one account.
What? Multiple devices? There must be one device, only one. There must be order.
NordVPN hides your IP address and you appear to be browsing from a different location. This not only protects your privacy, but also allows you to access content that might be restricted in your region. NordVPN has a no-logs policy, which stores no data or configurations on site.
If you want to live in a world where the government can take care of you by limiting what you can see and do online, then don't! Do not by any means go to the link in the description below, or do not go to the address nordvpn/history.
But if you do use the link below to get NordVPN, you will support the channel. Now, back to the video. With the Germans learning of the Russian plans via the interception, the Russian forces were caught in a vulnerable position, and the Germans destroyed a large part of the southern Russian army. With the southern Russian army unable to threaten East Prussia from the south, the Germans then drove the eastern Russian army from German territory. The Russian invasion of East Prussia had failed completely. Russia had failed to secure its northern flank, but it had achieved its goals in the south, and the Russian numerical advantage on the eastern front was so strong that it could afford to block the single German army in East Prussia, while the rest of its forces advanced towards Berlin. Russia began redeployments for the offensive towards Berlin. It started concentrating a strong force in the center of the front. This entailed moving away part of its forces from the front line in the south, which weakened the Russian forces there. The Austro-Hungarians were meanwhile strengthened by a German army and went on the counteroffensive against the weakened Russian forces. They made some territorial gains, but then they made contact with a strong Russian force. After realizing the weakness of their position, the Central Powers fell back to regroup near the German border. The Russian forces pursued them to the west, but the Central Powers had gained more strength. They counterattacked and pushed the Russian forces back. The Russian forces had suffered heavy casualties and were now weakened. Russia had to abort its advance towards Berlin. The failure of the Russian attack marked the final failure of Russia's and France's plan to defeat Germany. The French attack had failed when Germany outflanked its forces from the north and occupied large parts of the French territory. By the end of 1914, the offensives of all sides had failed, and it could be a good time to make peace and end the conflict. However, both sides had reasons to believe that they could win the war. The Entente nations believed that if they had mobilized their superior economies and manpower for the war effort, they could become stronger than the Central Powers, and they continued to fight. The Central Powers were militarily stronger at that point in time, and they attempted to make moves to win the war before that. Germany had success against France on the Western Front, but it was still threatened by Russia in the east. Germany decided that it now needed to also inflict a large defeat on Russia. For this reason, it planned to launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. After Russia had been dealt with, Germany could then turn against France and defeat it completely. Germany began its offensive on the Eastern Front with an attack from East Prussia. It increased its forces there and attacked towards the south. However, the German forces were unable to make much progress. The balance of power between Russia and the Central Powers on the Eastern Front was too similar for Germany to achieve large success. Germany decided to increase its forces and continue the offensive. It turned to the southern part of the front. It strengthened the Austro-Hungarian troops with German armies. Having thus increased their advantage, the Central Powers forces achieved success. They struck a heavy blow to the Russian forces and pushed them back. They then launched the second phase of the offensive and gained even more territory. Russia had suffered heavy losses during this offensive and was now weakened. The Germans continued the offensive and attacked from East Prussia. They broke through the Russian defenses and put the Russian forces in the center of the front under the threat of encirclement. Russia had to pull back its forces from this area and suffered heavy losses during the retreat. The Germans then outflanked the Russian forces from the north. This forced the Russian forces into another retreat and gave Germany another group of prisoners, with Russia suffering the loss of another 750,000 soldiers. Then Germany stopped the offensive on the Eastern Front in order to concentrate on the west. With Russia suffering heavy losses and losing buffer territory, Germany could take part of its forces from the Eastern Front and prepare to defeat France. But by 1916, the balance of power was not as favorable for Germany as in the previous year. Previously, Russia had run low in weapons and Britain lacked a large army. By 1916, these shortfalls had begun to be fixed, as Britain had created a large ground force and deployed it on the Western Front, and Russia had begun to benefit from its expanding military industry. The Central Powers had gained another opponent as Italy joined the Entente. The balance of power began to shift in favor of the Entente nations. But at the start of 1916, Germany still had the advantage, and the German forces moved out to defeat France in the Battle of Verdun. In order to distract the German forces from France, The other Entente nations launched their own attacks against the Central Powers. One of them was Russia. The Russian army had been weakened by the Central Powers offensive, and first attacks in the northern part of the front against the German forces did not work out. But a later offensive against Austria-Hungary in the summer brought some success. Part of the Austro-Hungarian defenses were broken, and Germany had to send its forces to help Austria-Hungary to hold the front. Further attacks made the Austro-Hungarian military suffer further casualties, making it weaker. The weakening of Austria-Hungary prompted Romania to go to war against Austria-Hungary and attack it by moving over the Carpathians. Germany had to divert even more forces from the Western Front to meet this emergency. The intervention was successful, and the Central Powers forces counterattacked the Romanian forces and occupied half of Romanian territory. Russia had to redeploy its forces and recreate a new defensive line. The offensives of the Entente nations forced Germany to abandon the Battle of Verdun. Now the Entente nations were stronger than the Central Powers. With the advantage on their side, the Entente planned to go on the offensive to finally defeat the Central Powers and put an end to the war. British, French, Italian and Russian armies were to combine their attacks for a massive offensive against the Central Powers. But 3 years of fighting had caused the war exhaustion to rise high in the Entente nations. The French offensive had to be stopped after large losses had caused its army to rise in mutiny. On the Eastern Front, Russia prepared to launch its own offensive. Russia had a strong numerical advantage, however, the war exhaustion had damaged the discipline of the Russian forces too. Russia made some territorial gains, but the Central Powers' counterattack broke the discipline of the Russian forces and pushed them out of Austro-Hungarian territory. With the French and Russian attacks failing, the Central Powers survived the Entente offensive. Meanwhile, because of the increasing war exhaustion, the internal stability of Russia began to drop to critical levels. Why did Russia not make peace with the Central Powers and exit the war? The Entente nations did have an upper hand over the Central Powers, but just barely. If Russia was to drop out of the war, then the Central Powers would probably be able to defeat the remaining Entente nations. It would then result in German domination of Europe and Germany be able to demand whatever it wanted from Russia. So Russia did not make peace and attempted to stay in the war. Soon the internal turmoil had grown to the extent that the Russian military began to lose its ability to resist the Central Powers and began to break apart as the internal turmoil caused the parts of the country to agitate for independence. Germany sought to weaken the Entente nations so that they would not be strong enough to threaten Germany in another war, and for this reason it wanted to draw the western territories of Russia away from the Entente and into its own alliance. German forces occupied large parts of the former territories of the Russian Empire and helped several of the independence movements to secure their statehood in alliance with Germany. This caused Russia to finally make peace with Germany and exit the war. With Russia out of the war, Germany attempted to use its emerging advantage to defeat the remaining Entente nations on the Western Front. However, the American forces came to the aid of the Entente, and the Entente managed to gain the upper hand over the Germans and defeat the German offensive. These defeats, coupled with the high war exhaustion, made Germany and Austria-Hungary to surrender to the Entente. The Entente nations demanded that the Central Powers forces retreat from the lands of the former Russian Empire, and the new nations in this territory gained complete independence from the Central Powers. Austria-Hungary had wanted to make a separate peace, but it was unable to do that, and by the end of the war exhaustion caused the empire to be at the brink of dissolution. Faced with the prospect of Austria-Hungary breaking up, the Entente nations supported the dissolution of Austria-Hungary so that Germany would not be able to have it as an ally in another war. The resistance to the German domination of Europe led to the collapse of the Russian Empire. Meanwhile, the defeat of Germany's side led to the dissolution of Austria-Hungary. As a result, in November of 1918, there were 14 new states in Eastern Europe. Despite the tumultuous events of the rest of the 20th century, most of these nations managed to prevail and continue to exist in the 21st century. Don't forget to check out this video sponsor NordVPN, and see you in the next video.